What is distinctive about the Palestinian refugee experience in Syria? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Nell Gabiam. Nell Gabiam is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Political Science at Iowa State University. She's the author of The Politics of Suffering, Syria's Palestinian Refugee Camps. Her more recent work focuses on Palestinians displaced by the ongoing conflict in Syria. Nell Gabiam, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you, Mouin. Happy to be here.
Thank you. I'd like to start by getting a profile of the Palestinian refugee community in Syria, at least as it existed until the current conflict in that country. How many refugees were there initially in Syria, and how many were there at the beginning of this century? Did they come from particular regions of Mandatory Palestine? Were they concentrated in particular areas of Syria? Did they live primarily in camps or in towns and cities? Give us a profile of this community, if you will.
Yeah, so in the aftermath of the 48 war and the Nakba, about 90,000 to 100,000 Palestinians became refugees in Syria. Most of them settled in the areas around Damascus. Mm-hmm. Most of them came from northern Palestine, from major cities like Haifa, Akka, Safed, and the surrounding villages. But some then made their way up north. And so you have camps kind of pretty much from the north to the south, with most of them concentrated in the south, but you do have camps up north. And a lot of my research is actually focused more on the camps in the north, camps like Neirab and Ain Atal. Before war broke out in Syria, the Palestinian population numbered about 560,000, according to UNRWA estimates. And so in terms of, camps and sort of, how they relate to Palestinian displacement to Syria, there are 12 recognized camps, recognized by UNRWA, basically. Interestingly, in the Syrian case, you have this official camps versus unofficial camps situation. Basically, there are 9 official camps, 9 recognized official camps, and then 3 recognized unofficial camps. Part of the difference is that those official camps are camps that were set up, in the aftermath of the Nakba. And where the UN UNRWA sort of had an official presence from the beginning. And then unofficial camps, they tended to emerge later on in the 50s and the 60s, usually through efforts by the Syrian government to kind of try to find a space where Palestinians who had been squatting in, some of the major Syrian cities could settle into. And so those also sort of became Palestinian communities and are referred to as camps. And then there's this sort of distinction also that with official camps, UNRWA takes care of things like sanitation, whereas in the unofficial camps, it's the Syrian government. But it's not really there's not really a fundamental difference.
And the largest camp in Syria is, of course, Yarmouk camp. Damascus, or on the southern approaches to Damascus, and this is an unofficial camp. Does that mean that UNRWA does not provide these kinds of services and facilities that it does elsewhere?
So thanks for that question, because it also gives me an opportunity to clarify something. So Yarmouk is the biggest camp, and it is an unofficial camp. It emerged in the late 50s. And that was when the Syrian government gave an opportunity to Palestinians who were squatting, mostly in Damascus, to basically build houses in this area that then became Yarmouk camp. As an unofficial camp, again, in terms of UNRWA's official duties, let's say in that camp, let's say UNRWA doesn't take care of sanitation, but aside from that, UNRWA does have a presence in the camp. Anywhere where there's a I don't know, a community, a gathering of Palestinians, it's not unusual for UNRWA to have some sort of presence. Now, in the case of Yarmouk, that presence is not as significant as it would be in one of the smaller, official camps. But UNRWA does have, I mean, there are UNRWA institutions in the camp. They're just not as prominent as they would be in an unofficial, in an official
Right.
camp. Yeah.
And you said your research focused primarily on camps in the north, I presume around Aleppo and Hama?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just that also gives another opportunity to sort of further elaborate, which is part of why UNRWA does have a presence, or did have a presence in Yarmouk, although again, not an imposing one. Part of it has to do also with, the fact that Yarmouk was so well integrated into Damascus. And so I think there was less of a need maybe for UNRWA. In the north, the two camps where I work in the north are Neirab and Ainatel. And Neirab is an official camp, Ainatel is not. But I would say that because of the needs of the populations there, these were kind of smaller camps with fewer resources, kind of isolated from Aleppo. And so in both those camps, I mean, UNRWA did have a significant presence.
And if we fast forward a bit to the eve of the Syria conflict, were these still primarily refugees from 1948, or were there also many refugees either from 1967, from the civil war in Jordan in 1970, from the Lebanese civil war, perhaps from Iraq and Kuwait? Do you have an indication of how that broke down as we approach towards 2010?
Yeah, so definitely, the Syria's Palestinian refugee population, the majority of them are refugees from the 48 war and their descendants, but definitely there were other displacements from the 67 war, from the Black September, 73. So there have been Palestinians who've been displaced from those events as well and who have ended up in Syria. They just make up a smaller population, and I'm off the top of my head, I can't think of the exact percentage, but they're a much smaller percentage, and they're not as likely to have had the same status as the others who were kind of much more integrated and officially sort of had most of the civil rights that Syrian nationals had.
And that brings me to my next question. In your book, you talk about Palestinian refugees in Syria as having the status of informal citizens. They neither had formal citizenship, as they did, for example, in Jordan, but nor did they experience the types of discrimination that we often saw in other Arab countries. Could you clarify what you mean with the concept of informal citizenship that Syria gave to the Palestinians in that country, and how that policy developed over the years?
Yeah, so I used the concept of informal citizenship to capture several different things. First of all, from a legal perspective, even though the Palestinians of Syria were never awarded citizenship in the way that, for example, Palestinians in Jordan were, in the 1950s, a law was passed that basically gave them most of the rights associated with Syrian citizenship. And by that, I mean access to public education, access to public sector employment, access to public health. Really the
Very
only
different
thing,
from Lebanon.
very, very different, very different. Yeah, so and some have argued that actually that the Palestinians of Syria were actually the most politically or let's say the less disenfranchised, even when compared to Jordan, because of the political marginalization of Palestinian Jordanians. But people have gone that far. So they had comparatively speaking, they had a pretty, Syrian authorities were pretty progressive in terms of the amount of rights that they had.
And maybe this is a good opportunity just to briefly interrupt you. And if you could clarify why Syria took the decision not to provide Palestinian refugees on its territory with citizenship.
So I don't have, or I'm not aware of any sort of official pronouncement about that. But the sense that I get from my research, but also from other official pronouncements from the Syrian government, I think there are two things. I think part of it, and I think that's something that most Arab countries, Arab host countries in the region have shared. I think there was a reluctance to fully integrate Palestinians or integrate them to the extent of extending citizenship to them, because there was a sense that that would leave Israel off the hook when it comes to the right of return. And in
So
terms
it
of
would be tantamount to resettlement, effectively.
right. So there was that, and I would assume that that played a role in the Syrian case as well. And then, you know, when I was doing research in Syria, my doctoral research that led to this book, this was the period between 2004 and 2006, I would hear quite often from Palestinians themselves that they weren't necessarily interested in citizenship, and for the same reasons. Now, I think there's been a shift, but we can talk about that later, just so I don't lose my thread here. So I think those two factors, both on the part of the Syrian government, but also the Palestinians, in terms of, you know, keeping Israel accountable, I think that played a role. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, and instead, or rather as an alternative to the provision of citizenship, Syria endowed the Palestinians on its territory with what you define as informal citizenship. And I think it's also important to point out that this is a policy that began in the 1950s, and as such has been shared by a whole variety of Syrian governments of different political persuasions over the decades. And you've described this as giving Palestinians in Syria virtually the same rights as Syrians in terms of access to public services and even public sector employment and so on. So I'd be very interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, and I think it is important to point out that the status of sort of near citizenship, if not full citizenship, predates the Assad regime, right? And so when we get to current events, I think it's important to keep that in mind. So what that means is basically that officially, you know, that access to all these opportunities, to these resources that Syrian citizens have is recognized. In practice, it doesn't always mean that, you know, Palestinian refugees necessarily had full access. And this also connects to some of my research. Places like Yarmouk sort of emerged in the outskirts of Damascus and sort of was very easily and rapidly incorporated. And so in that case, you really see that process in practice working really well. In the case of, you know, and also I think a lot of the refugees who settled, Palestinian refugees who settled in Yarmouk were of urban origins. When you get to the smaller camps, you know, up north, a lot of these refugees came from villages in northern Palestine, more rural background, ended up in these kind of small, isolated communities. And so in practice, there was a certain level of marginalization, at least in some of these camps, even if not coming from kind of deliberate Syrian policy, but just because of the historical circumstances. So I think that's important to point out. But yeah, but to come back to the issue of informal citizenship, so there is this official recognition that, you know, for the most part, you're going to be treated just like Syrian citizens. I think it's except for the right to vote, except for owning agricultural land, except for owning more than one property. So really, there's not a big difference here officially. But also, to me, the informal part has to do with the fact that Palestinians weren't really seen as a foreign presence by the Syrians or by the Syrian government. And I think this all goes back to kind of the, you know, the sort of the political and geographical imaginary of Greater Syria. And I think this, you know, decades long, you know, in the aftermath of Syrian independence, attempt by various Syrian regimes to sort of reclaim, right, Greater Syria, these territories that it sees as having been amputated. from the Syrian territory, and really seeing Palestinians as part of that. And also, before 1948, I think in terms of anti-colonial struggles, I think definitely there was, before 48, there were anti-colonial efforts that kind of joined the people who are now called Palestinians and those who are called Syrians, in the same struggle, and where they weren't thinking in terms of Palestine versus Syria, right? But more maybe closer to an imaginary that's maybe closer to greater Syria.
So in a certain respect, Syrians looked at Palestine and the Palestinians almost as an extension of themselves, rather than a foreign community that they were hosting on their soil.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
You've also written about the importance and symbolism of the refugee camp for Palestinians. I suspect particularly in more recent decades, many people will go to these camps and say, well, these look more like urban quarters, even if very poor and neglected ones. And, when people think of refugee camps, they think of windswept tents and, 3 families to a unit and so on. But nevertheless, they continue to have the status of refugee camps and are perceived both by the residents and those around them as refugee camps. Talk a bit about the importance and the symbolism of the refugee camp for the Palestinian refugees in Syria.
Yeah, and so I think I would actually start by even saying that, yeah, definitely the camps in Syria don't look like your stereotypical, idea of a camp, and we're definitely not talking about tent camps. But even that aside, no 2 camps really look the same. And so, Yarmouk is very different, for example, than Nedab up north, which is different than Ain Atal. Yarmouk looks more like just an urban neighborhood within Damascus, whereas Ain Atal kind of looks more like
a distinctive area.
Distinctive, let's say, but urbanized, but in a very kind of distinctive way. Definitely not what you imagine as part of a big city. And then Ain Atal is sort of kind of has this feel of a village almost. But again, but neither is a camp in kind of the stereotypical understanding. And so in what sense have they kept their identity as camps? I think it happens on several different levels. Part of it is that there are communities that are inhabited, for the most part, that are inhabited majoritarily by Palestinians, and that Palestinians themselves have very much sort of kept that identity alive. Part of it, and I think this is something you see in other camps also in the region, part of it is the way that these spaces are imbued with, you mentioned symbolism, with imagery that, connects back to Palestine. So in terms of names of streets or, graffiti or images on walls and things like that. Part of it also had to do with the level of political activism. I think that's another way of which political activism. So in Syria, Palestinians have been in this interesting position where, despite the fact that we have an authoritarian regime, they've been able to be politically active, at least in relation to Israel and to the Palestinian cause. And so that's another way, I think, that these spaces have been imbued with Palestinian identity, Palestinian history. And then, yeah, so I would say it definitely goes beyond just the infrastructure of the camp, the extent to which the place is urbanized or not. I think a lot of what makes these spaces Palestinian spaces has to do with the people themselves and the kinds of communities that they've created and that they've, really made an effort to maintain. Now, infrastructure does influence, I think, identity and, identity and vice versa. And so that's I discuss some of those tensions in the book. But to me, what's interesting to me about Yarmouk is that not only infrastructurally, economically, you might say even socially, did it become integrated into Damascus, but despite that, it still kept its identity as a Palestinian refugee camp. And this despite the fact that Syrians started moving into the area, and Palestinians became outnumbered by Syrians. But when you walk into Yarmouk, at least into the heart of Yarmouk, it's a distinctively Palestinian space. And so that those places that remain camps, I think, has a lot to do with the practices of the inhabitants themselves.
Those who have never visited these locations and who have primarily a political stake or an ideological take on them tend towards a view that these camps exist only because of the policies of the Arab host governments and of UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees, which collectively are artificially perpetuating these camps. Is that a conclusion you reached in your research? And if not, how do you assess these arguments?
The short answer is no. But again, I'm speaking really within the context of Syria, which I think it's so when it comes to Syria, the short answer is no. This is not something that you can just say has been perpetuated by UNRWA or by authorities, because Palestinians in Syria are not forced to live in camps. And actually a significant number of Palestinians in Syria, let's just say pre-war right now, were living outside of camps. Depending on whether or not you count unofficial camps as camps, the numbers differ. But if you don't count unofficial camps as camps, then you'll see sources that claim that 2/3 of Syria's Palestinians don't live in camps. If you count the unofficial camps as camps, which brings Yarmouk into the mix, Yarmouk being the largest gathering, then it's about only 1/3 of Palestinians don't live in camps. But
it's roughly consistent with other major concentrations of Palestine.
Okay, yeah. So the point is, there is a significant number of Palestinians who don't live in camps, and there's no rule, there's no law, there's no, that says that Palestinians have to live in camps. Now, one small caveat is that it would appear that, over the years, various Syrian administrations have maybe encouraged Palestinians to sort of live in or to kind of congregate together. Hence, I think the emergence of unofficial camps. But I think this has more to do with kind of surveillance and control, the sense that it would be easier to control and surveil them. So in that sense, maybe people who make the argument that you started your question with have a sense, but there's not been any sort of deliberate effort to keep them in camps keep Palestinians in camps that I've seen.
And as a follow-up to that, the other argument that's often made is that Palestinian refugee identity is something that is, in essence, artificial and is being promoted by UNRWA and by Arab governments for ulterior motives, whether in order to perpetuate themselves as institutions or for political reasons to deflect criticism of their record in terms of policies towards their citizens. Did you find that the Palestinian refugee identity is something that was artificial, or was it really intrinsically shared and perhaps embraced is not the right word, but adopted by the Palestinian community in Syria?
So I'll start with a kind of much more general and broader assertion in terms of how I understand and view identity. Mm-hmm. I think identity in general is never static. It's mobile, certainly. It's shifting, it's contextual.
Yes.
Sometimes it forms in reaction to, certain events or to a particular state of affairs. And I think that applies to all of us, including Palestinians. My point is, I don't have a straightforward answer for you. To me, it's not about whether, again, short answer, no. We can't say that, because UNRWA has sort of maintained its services in these camps, or, Arab regimes for political reasons have sort of, try to push this sense of identity on the population. Absolutely not. At the same time, I also don't think we should see Palestinian identity as this sort of this thing, right, that either Palestinians have or they don't, and then try to figure out, well, is it coming from them or is it being imposed?
Right.
I think, people's sense of self evolves with their surroundings, but I would say a big part of, to the extent that there's a sense of Palestinianness, which very, for sure was there when I was doing my research, and for sure is still there as I'm doing research on Palestinians who've been displaced from Syria. This is something that's, it's something that's mobile, that's shifting, that's not static, that doesn't always mean the same thing, but for sure, it's definitely, it's not just being influenced by outside actors. It's also
Right.
being influenced from the inside. If
Well,
that answers your question.
No, that and I think you make the essential point that identity is dynamic and contextual and never static. My question was more about these assertions that this is kind of an artificial construct that exists to serve the ulterior motives of external parties. But I think you've clarified that very
Yeah,
clearly.
no, and I would just add that I think that assertion just completely strips Palestinians or Palestinian refugees, if we're talking about Palestinian refugees, of agency.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next topic I'd like to discuss with you is also the subject of your current research, which is the impact of the Syrian conflict on Palestinian refugees in Syria. But before doing that, if I could just address an earlier era. And as you know, relations between the Palestinian leadership and the Syrian leadership before the war were notoriously poor. And I'm thinking particularly about the extremely mutually suspicious and hostile relationship between the late PLO leader Yasser Arafat and the late Syrian president Hafez al-Assad. Arafat, George Habash, many other Palestinian leaders spent time in Syrian jails. Syria also intervened in Lebanon in 1976 at a time when the Lebanese national movement in cooperation with the Palestinians seemed to be gaining the upper hand in that civil war. And my question is not so much about these political relations, but about whether these longstanding political tensions between the Palestinian leadership, or at least key elements of it, and the Syrian leadership, and also given that Syria was sponsoring Palestinian organizations that were essentially loyal to Damascus, is whether this had an impact on the Palestinian community in Syria.
So at the time that I was doing my early research, so again, that period, well before the war, 2000,
early 2006.
Yeah. So the early, I mean, I was definitely aware of, there were definitely Palestinians who were affiliated with Fatah, who were in jail that I was aware of, or Palestinians who had been sent to fight in Lebanon by the Syrian regime, but then kind of ended up siding with their fellow Palestinians instead of fight for Assad, who were in jail. So it was definitely kind of there. And so, yeah, so during the time of my research, definitely, and you just didn't really talk about Fatah, and if you had allegiance or, if you had sympathy, it wasn't something that you really made public. I
kept
also,
it to yourself.
Yeah, you kept it to yourself. And I do know, I did meet people who, not many, but definitely people whose careers, whose futures were kind of more or less, I don't know, really impacted negatively by the fact that, they were associated with Fatah or, yeah, so it had an impact in that way, but it wasn't really something that was sort of spoken about openly. These were instances that I would find out about this when I really got close to people where they felt comfortable opening up, but that was definitely something that was there.
But you didn't get the sense that there was kind of a let's say, generalized policy towards Palestinians in Syria that was the consequence of political tensions between the Syrian government and the Palestinian leadership, the way, for example, that you described earlier in Jordan after 1970?
No, my sense was very clearly that the Syrian government went after Fatah, and ruthlessly so, and Fatah affiliated Palestinians, but this did not result in kind of some sort of general collective punishment from what I could see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so now we turn to the subject of your current research, which is the impact of the Syrian war on the Palestinian refugee community in Syria. And I'd like to perhaps frame this question in the following way. We're all too familiar with the horrendous and horrific consequences that this war has had upon upon ordinary Syrians throughout the country. Are those also the experiences of Palestinians, or have they had different, separate, distinctive impacts of this? Have they experienced distinctive impacts of this conflict because of their status?
I would start by saying that the war, as you mentioned, has had just horrific consequences on the civilian population of Syria as a whole, including on the Palestinian population. Palestinians definitely were not spared, the atrocities or the horrors that Syrians have experienced as a result of that of the war. Whether it's, destruction of their communities, loss of life, imprisonment, torture, exile, so to me, there's a lot of overlap. And so I would say, the civilian population as a whole has been horrifically affected. However, I do think Palestinians have faced additional barriers as a result of being Palestinian. And, this, I think, becomes clear, especially when it comes to Palestinians who are trying to flee Syria, in the aftermath of the war.
Before we get to those Palestinians, have you seen any indications that either the government or any of the armed opposition groups in any way singled out or targeted Palestinians in the way that we saw, for example, in Iraq after 2003 or in Lebanon during the 1970s?
Yes, definitely. So in terms of what's been happening in Syria, since the uprisings and the war, even at the outset of the uprisings, when the Assad government was still in denial that there were popular uprisings, taking hold in the country, there was an attempt to scapegoat, quote unquote, foreigners, foreign agents, and as well as the Palestinians, and in some cases to actually, to actually blame them in a few instances where you had government official blaming Palestinians for some of the violence that was sort of, or the protests, and to the extent that they turned violent, that the violence that was happening.
We're talking 2011 now.
We're talking 2011 now. I'm trying to remember exactly which camp. I think it was a Ramal camp, I think. I think it was in the Homs area, but anyway, or I'm getting my facts confused, but definitely there were a few instances, including just instances of basically blaming Palestinian refugees as sort of having instigated kind of the disruptions that were taking place, and kind of being named as so, as such, that, it was Palestinians basically making trouble. So I think that happened a few times. And that came from the Syrian government in its effort to blame outsiders and foreigners. And so to me, to throw Palestinians with blaming foreigners and outsiders, to me, that was really kind of one of the first instances of, we started this talk by me, talking about just how integrated and welcome Palestinians
Right.
have been in Syria. And to me, that moment kind of is almost a break, right? For the first time, oh, you're with those foreigners who are
You don't
causing
really
trouble.
belong here.
Yeah, you don't really belong here. So I think that's really significant. And that's the first time that, well, that at least, that's one key time that I really see that is in 2011, trying to deflect attention from the fact that there was actually a popular rising happening. When it comes to kind of both sides of the conflict, the rebels as well as the government, one complaint or issue that came up in several interviews, and that kind of shows that Palestinians were in a slightly different kind of situation than their Syrian counterpart, is their experience at checkpoints, where in several cases, people were really hurt by the fact that once they would approach a checkpoint, regardless of whether it was a rebel checkpoint or government checkpoint, the fact that they were Palestinian, especially as the conflict progressed, automatically made them suspect. They must be collaborating with the other side. And this is a moment to go back to Palestinian identity and sort of, if we want to think about identity as dynamic, for some, this was a moment when their Palestinian identity was really reinforced. Where, and for some, in some cases, these were people who had never really thought about their identity too much or had thought very much part of the Syrian community. And those experiences at the checkpoints all of a sudden reminded them that they were different.
Whether they liked it or not.
Yeah, whether they liked it or not. So yeah, those are and then also through my interviews with Palestinians who've been displaced by the war, to the extent that some actually really did identify with the uprisings and really identify with what the Syrian people were going through, and kind of thought of themselves in a certain way as Syrian, as part of that.
Well, and this reinforces your earlier point about how well integrated they were.
Yeah. Instances of them being told, this doesn't concern you, like stay out of it, ma dakhaltu, like, yeah. That was another moment. I think those are a few examples of instances where ultimately they were reminded that they weren't really Syrian, or they didn't fully belong, or at least they were made to feel that way.
But you said the main differences you saw concerned Palestinians in Syria when they tried to leave the country.
Again, I might be a little biased because that's kind of the focus of the current research, and I didn't do research in Syria as the war was going on, so I have more access to people who are trying to flee, so that might be part of it. But it's very clear that very early on at the onset of the war, international borders closed in the region within the Middle East were closing very quickly ahead of Palestinians, whereas their Syrian counterpart, armed with their Syrian passports, were having a much easier time. I think over time, given how long the conflict has lasted, I think it's become pretty hard for Syrians as well at this point. But at least until 2015. Palestinians definitely had a much harder time trying to find protection outside of Syria than their counterpart, because they were Palestinian, because they were, for political reasons, because of their Palestinian identity. When it comes to Egypt, using this notion that, Israel's responsible, and so we're not going to, take care of you, because otherwise that means we're letting Israel off the hook. That being used as an excuse to very quickly not only stop issuing visas to Palestinians, but also to those who are already there, denying them services, especially and also registration with UNHCR, for example. In Turkey, up until 2016, while Syrians could go to Syria with a visa, Palestinians had to go clandestinely because they weren't able to have a visa. Jordan by 2012 had closed its borders to Palestinians. So it's just one of those instances where it's very clear that being Palestinian, at least within the region, is a liability if you're trying to flee the war in Syria.
It's not only being Palestinian, but I think it's also a function of being stateless.
Yes.
That's when you begin to recognize that it's a significant issue that can mean the difference between life.
Yes,
and life.
no, absolutely. So I think some of it was, if you take Turkey, for example, some of it also was that, there's a war and you're expecting refugees, but the war is in Syria. So you're expecting Syrian refugees.
Yeah.
And one of the first documents you're going to ask for is, the passport or some sort of official document that proves that they're Syrian nationals, and Palestinians didn't have that. And in a lot of places, including in Europe, initially, they tended to fall through the cracks because the expectation was a Syrian refugee with a Syrian document. And then they would say, well, I'm Palestinian. And to say, where's your Palestinian document? Well, I'm from Syria. Well, then why don't you have Syrian? And it would just be this. And it took in Europe, I think it took 1 or 2 years before the bureaucracies really got it straight. So that was definitely an issue, statelessness.
And I realize that there are not many there isn't much reliable data, and also that your own research has been very much focused on countries to which Palestinian refugees from Syria have fled rather than within Syria. But that notwithstanding, do you have an indication, have many, have most, have only a few of Syria's Palestinian refugees left the country since 2011?
So the short answer is we don't have any definitive statistics. We have statistics from estimates. I wouldn't call it, estimates from UNRWA, and we have estimates from the action group for the Palestinians of Syria, which is, I think, based in the UK. And according to UNRWA, and I think UNRWA stopped actually even, I think they've stopped updating that. But I think the latest estimates, let's say, according to UNRWA, is that about, is that 20% of Syria's pre-war population has fled beyond Syrian borders. When you look at the numbers from the action group for the Palestinians of Syria, the latest I saw was they were estimating about 100,000 of Syria's Palestinian population had, at least 100,000 had ended up that's just in Europe. And then,
that's about a fifth, I think.
Yeah. And then maybe about 50,000 maybe in the region. What's interesting, so again, we have no clear estimates. The numbers are possibly higher. What's interesting to me is that when I've talked to Palestinians, to my Palestinian interlocutors, the sense I've gotten from several is that the numbers are huge, right? Some have even said, oh, most of the Palestinians have been displaced. That's not the narrative we're getting from UNRWA. So I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows for sure. But I think to the extent that we have official estimates, it's closer to a fifth of the population.
And in the meantime, several, at least refugee camps in Syria, Yarmouk, I think Handarat, near Aleppo, have basically been razed to the ground by the fighting.
So Yarmouk has a large portion of it has been destroyed, and it's been mostly depopulated. However, apparently there's a trickle of people that are living there or have are trying to live there or have moved back. I think we're talking like, I don't know, in the low thousands maybe. So there is life in the camp, but the vast majority of the population has been displaced, and a significant amount of the camp has been completely destroyed. I think it's about 70% of the camp has been completely
And that
destroyed.
was after the Islamic State movement.
After the Islamic State, yeah, after the Syrian campaign against the Islamic State, so 2018.
Yeah.
And there's no, as far as Yarmouk is concerned, I don't think there's any kind of sort of official sort of return, right, of some of the population. It's just that there are people who never really left, right, and maybe a few who have been able to come back and live there regardless. But it's a tiny proportion. In Handarat, which is also Ain Atal, there's kind of an official recognition that some families are moving back. I think a few hundred families. The prior population was about 6,000, I think, and a few hundred, or a few, at least, families are moving back, and UNRWA has sort of, mediatized it. And so there's kind of an official process of rebuilding the camp and trying to resume services in Handarat. That hasn't started in Yarmouk, to my knowledge.
I see. Finally, I'd like to ask you, you've researched these issues, but you also have, if I can call it, a pre-existing personal connection to this region and this issue. You mention in your book that you were first introduced to Syria by your mother, and that she also previously was a teacher in the Gaza Strip after the Nakba. Perhaps you could tell us a little about that.
Yeah, so kind of my interest in the Palestinian question, it's a combination of factors. My mother definitely plays a major role.
And she's not from the region, just to be clear.
My mother's American.
Yes.
Yes, and my father's from Togo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was born and grew up in Togo. And maybe I'll start with Togo, actually, as part of kind of the sort of more personal aspect. When I was in high school, what I learned about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was that basically this was, and the 48 war, was that this was a conflict between European Jews, fleeing anti-Semitism, who basically came to Palestine, which I learned was a desert, and were attacked by surrounding Arab populations who did not want them there. I learned nothing. I learned nothing about the native Arab population. I was told nothing about the Palestinians. I was told nothing about Palestinian refugees. Fast forward to being a student, a college student, I took a course at Columbia University, the typical peoples and cultures of the Middle East and North Africa. It's a typical anthro course. I ended up being an anthro major. And in that course, the issue of Palestinian refugees came up, and that was my first introduction to Palestinian refugees. That was my first introduction to realizing that there was a native population on the land, that it was not a desert, that people had been forced out. And it was a moment where I was really shocked that I hadn't known this before, that this wasn't common knowledge, that I had to take this class to know this. It was this whole perspective about the conflict that I hadn't known about, and really, it made me feel really ignorant and really wanting to know more. And right around that time, my mother who had been living in Togo with my father, ended up getting a job in Kuwait as a teacher at the American school there. And this is the late 90s. And by that point, most of the Palestinians of Kuwait have been expelled because Arafat, supported Saddam Hussein or expressed support for him. So they've been punished, and most of them have expelled.
It was in the aftermath of the Iraqi invasion and occupation.
Yeah, aftermath of the Iraqi invasion. Yes, so late 1990s, after the first Gulf War.
Right.
But nonetheless, a few Palestinians stayed, I think, especially teachers. So My mom ended up getting to know some of them, became good friends with a Palestinian Jordanian who was also a teacher at her school. And I think she also then got this whole perspective that she'd never really heard about, and really got interested and realized just how ignorant she was and wanted to really better inform herself. So those two things happened. And I then also got a job as a teacher in Kuwait, a lot of American schools in Kuwait. So I got a job at one of them and joined my mother. While I spent 2 years there, and her bookshelves were full of books about the Palestinian issue, and so that kind of furthered my interest in my education. And during that time, we traveled a lot, and ended up going to Syria, but also to Jordan, and then through the Allenby Bridge to Jerusalem for a few days. So I think all of that influenced my interest. And then by 2001, I was a grad student at that point, and she ended up getting a job as a teacher at the American school in Gaza, which I believe was bombed. Yes. I don't think it was destroyed during one of the Hamas-Israel wars, so no longer exists. But she got a job there for a summer, so she was in Gaza for a summer, and I got to visit her. So that combination of factors kind of led me to pursue research on the Palestinian refugee question and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think it was the issue through which I not only was made aware of my political ignorance, but also, for reasons that I think I still need to explore, was kind of the issue that really started my political awakening.
Well, it's a fascinating combination of the personal, the political, and the professional. Nell Gabiam, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, Mouin. Really appreciate it.